Welcome to all of you. Thank you so much for coming to our first virtual Authors Talk series. Our first discussion will be on the book, The Impact of Global Drug Policy on Women, Shifting the Needle. And our three guest speakers are the editors, Julia Buxton, Giavana Margo, and Lona Berger. I have a brief bio just to give you a bit of background in each of these ladies. Giavana Margo is a portfolio analyst for the Global Drug Policy Program at the Open Society Foundations and works primarily on advancing drug policy reform in the US. Her background is in research and advocacy on the topic of gender, drug policy, and harm reduction. She also holds a degree in critical gender studies from the Central European University. Lona holds a master's degree in public policy, jointly awarded by the Central European University and the Barcelona Institute of International Studies. During this time, she conducted research on the gendered impact of drug policy and is interested in the nexus of policy and advocacy and in bringing her research learnings into programmatic roles. Currently, she is a public engagement officer at Action Canada for Sexual Health Rights, where she seeks to generate ideas, awareness, and mobilization in favor of sexual and reproductive rights. She is particularly interested in the impact of drug involvement on sexual rights as seen through the lens of reproductive justice and has applied this analysis in this and her other roles. And Julia is a British Academy Global Professor in the Department of Criminology at the University of Manchester and a region head for the Andes at Oxford Analytica. She has thematic expertise on drugs development, conflict, and post-conflict reconstruction, geographical expertise on the Andes, and a consultancy background in conflict and gender-sensitive policy and program design. Her 4-year British Academy-funded research explores supply-side change in the international illicit drug markets and the implications of Brexit for UK drug markets. At the Central European University, Julia managed a series of awards from Open Society Foundation's Global Drug Policy Program that enabled research and international workshops on drug policy analysis and the gendered impacts of drug policy enforcement. So we are in excellent hands today with our three authors. And with that, I will give them the floor. Welcome and so much thank you for being our first of the speakers in our virtual series. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giavana, and we're delighted to have this opportunity to present the book, and thank you very, very much to everybody who's attending. What we're planning to do in terms of the structure of this session is that my colleague Lona will begin with a few slides which situate this drug policy issue, and then Giavana will take over talking about how we really tried to design and develop this publication. And then I'll come in at the end with the key findings from the research and from the book, and then we'll open the floor to questions which we hope many of you have for us. So I will hand over straight away to Lona. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Julia. And yes, to echo Julia, thank you so much, Giavana, and we're really grateful to be able to share this research with you. So we'd like to begin by looking briefly at the inception of this project and the rationale for the book. And the initial sort of sparking point for that was this acknowledgement that the scale and nature of women's drug involvement is changing. So we've seen over the last several decades a significant increase in women who are using illicit drugs, also who are engaged in supply activities, who are engaged in drug crop cultivation, and who are impacted by drug enforcement. So both directly as people who use drugs and indirectly as partners and parents of people who use drugs and in caregiving capacities. And so this has taken shape within a broader context of shifts within drug policy over the last decades. But what we found is that the gender dynamics remain highly under-researched and that these accelerated shifts haven't been reflected in or accurate or adequately responded to in policy and programming. And so we identified here a twofold gap. So we can see that there's this absence of analysis in many spaces, and by extension, really gender insensitive programming, and that women are largely written out of or ignored in drug policy scholarship. In clinical drug research, we see small samples which aren't necessarily capturing the experiences of women and which are largely based out of North America and Europe and don't necessarily reflect other regional experiences and realities. We see in the way that we're collecting and analyzing data in both national and international drug policy design, monitoring and evaluation and metrics, there's a great degree of gender insensitivity. This is true as well in impact assessment and data gathering. And so it's important to highlight also that while we're speaking in general terms about a gap in representation, this is hugely amplified for trans women, for gender diverse people, for racialized women, and across other axes of exclusion. And so collectively, what we see here is that unless otherwise stated, whether in research, in programming, in policy, in academia, the imagined subject of these policies is typically male. And this is true in experiences of use, of cultivation, of production, of supply, of trade, and has huge gendered implications. And so on the other side of this, we see that women, when present in these narratives, are often essentialized or presented in ways which are lacking nuance and often problematic. So we see on one side of the coin, women being presented as inherently innocent, as victims, as needing protection from the state or other actors, or as failed women, as inherently maligned in contradiction with their natural or proper roles as women, and as deserving of punishment. And this plays in then to disproportionate or differential punitive measures enacted upon women. We see that women are presented as without agency or autonomy in the roles that they take within drug economies, and often as existing only as wives or girlfriends, as peripheral to a primary male counterpart who participates in different aspects of drug economies. And so across the board, what we're really seeing here as well is this failure to account for the reasons why people engage in drug spheres. So the role of pleasure and other functions of drug use, and then also the autonomy, the stability, the security that often is offered by participation in other aspects of drug economies. And so in addressing these gaps, we had this series of core questions that we wanted to incorporate into the collection. So firstly, we wanted to understand why there was this increase in women in illicit drug markets, what the dynamics of this increase were, and how they were differential to those of men within the context of a broader increase in illegal drug markets and use and supply and demand. Also, what the impacts of drug policy enforcement are on women, how they're differential, and how they serve to reinforce and to amplify other patterns, existing patterns of exclusion. We wanted to look as well at where women's voices are in drug policy, where they're being expressed and where they're being actively excluded, and how we can bring them further into this conversation. And then also exploring where is the gender data, where is it not, and what the implications of its absence are. We also wanted to look a little bit at how policy can be more responsive to these shifts, how we can meet the pace of changing circumstances, and some examples of best practice, and also look at the role of states and the ability of states to meet rights obligations within this framework. And so we'll talk a little bit more about our approach, but in really simple terms, we wanted to ensure that it was intersectional. So this book being a recognition that drug involvement through whatever means produces exclusions, and that these exclusions are intertwined and layered upon one another. So representing differential experiences within the book was really important. And then also recognizing that as a system of control, the way that drug policy has been conceptualized and operationalized historically and today is a feminist issue, is also a racial justice issue, and also reproduces other series of exclusions. So weaving these all together throughout the collection. We also wanted to collect a diverse range of voices and perspectives. So not only geographically, but also in terms of positionality, ensuring that we had representation from academia, from scholarship, from NGOs, from programmatic and practitioner roles, and also really importantly, from people with lived experience. And then finally, feeding this back into diverse spheres of influence, ensuring that not only was this collection accessible in terms of being freely available and open access, but also that the content was of relevance and could feed back into the sectors and the communities and the people who were feeding into this collection. And so before we can really look at the more nuanced aspects of some of these questions, we feel it's important to understand what really is going on here. What's changed, what's propelling these shifts, and what has fueled the changes in how, why, and to what degree women participate in drug markets. And so what we can see here is that there's this sort of nexus of different elements which reinforce each other and play into one another that have changed in the past decades and that have contributed to this opening up, or this this vacuum within which women can fill an important spot within these economies. So firstly, expanding global markets, we see that there's this increased availability and accessibility of illicit drug supply, that drugs are cheaper and more widely available and accessible than ever. Additionally, we see that there's supply and demand shifts. So no longer this really clearly delineated distinction between global south cultivation and global north synthetic production, but that there's a broadening and a diversification of how drugs are being produced and distributed. And we see as well penetration of the illicit drug trade into previously insulated areas. So it's no longer major cities and hotspots, but rather almost universally available and yeah. We also see that there's a really important component of gendered poverty, especially as it relates to the spheres of cultivation and supply. So this massive increase in women as heads of households and the income demands and responsibilities that come with that, migration, conflict, urban-rural inequities, and then gendered roles in informal economies. And again, recognizing the stability and autonomy that participation in drug markets often offers in comparison to other industries, and especially informal labor. And then looking at more broad experiences of gender autonomy and empowerment and this increased financial independence, social and political autonomy, and recognizing that this doesn't apply only to formal labor markets or spheres of experience, but also within drug economies. And finally, looking at nightlife and entertainment and the role of drugs as a source of pleasure and how those dynamics have changed and expanded and gained sort of normalcy within our current context. And so what we see here is that these together collectively, these factors have resulted in an increased number of women who act within drug economies in different roles, resultant to that who are vulnerable to violence and exploitation within the drug trade, who require treatment, support, and health interventions, often which are not tailored to them or not responsive to their distinct needs, and in the criminal justice systems and incarceration. Also, we see that women are leading peer-driven initiatives, that they're at the forefront of harm reduction and reform efforts. And I'd like to share a quick quote from the introduction, which the three of us authored collectively, as I think it speaks to sort of the breadth and the diversity of experience that we were trying to represent and to open up within the collection. So whether as cultivators, manufacturers, distributors, and users of months, or indirectly as the partner, parent, or carer of people involved in drug markets, an ever-expanding number of women are engaging with plant-based, chemical, and diverted pharmaceutical substances. In turn, this means that more women are being caught up in drug policy enforcement. And I think this speaks to the levels and the diversity of experiences we were incorporating, but also we'd like to speak a little bit further to why this is important. What does it mean that there are more women involved in these processes? So it's important to situate ourselves within the context of drug spheres and also drug policy spheres as deeply, deeply masculinized spaces. So we see that men are overly represented and the dominant actors in the manufacture, supply, and distribution of drugs, in organized crime and disorganized crime, in other drug-related crime and violence, in arrests and incarceration, in drug use and related deaths and illnesses, but then also in criminal justice systems, in the security sector and law enforcement, in policy spheres, public health, treatment, and perhaps most importantly, in setting social norms and the perpetuation also of social norms. And so what this means is not only that women's voices tend to be excluded within these spaces, but to again quote from the book, in emerging into this heavily masculinized space, women are experiencing new forms of misogyny, exclusion, violence, and sexual violence perpetrated by both non-state and state actors, informal and formal institutions. This layers onto existing practices of gender discrimination and exclusion. And so we see here that there's this process of double exclusion, that not only are women marginalized and excluded in the sphere that they're directly interacting with, whether as users, producers, cultivators, but also in the sphere that's aiming to regulate or enforce that. And I'd like to, before we move on with some deeper contextualization of the process of the book, I'd like to draw upon sort of what I feel is much of the crux of the issue and has guided the tone of the book. So understanding that drug enforcement has long been conceptualized as a moral issue, and that this shapes the way that we understand the gendered nature of it. So again, quoting from the introduction, unlike any other area of public policy, the persistence of current drug policy approaches is justified through reference to unmeasured protection of health and well-being and the promotion of higher moral purpose. So we see that when women do engage in this world, it is seen as especially ghastly and objectionable, as in contradiction with their natural or proper roles, especially activities associated with risk-taking, with troublemaking, with rule-breaking are seen as inherently masculinized and inappropriate for women. And this is reflected in punitive measures enacted against them. So women's drug involvement runs against described notions of femininity and motherhood across cultures and societies, and women are disproportionately punished, stigmatized, and vilified. And this, sets the tone for much of what we wanted to explore within the collection, not only in terms of how these dynamics affect women, but also how they are reacting to, responding to, and resisting these dynamics. And with that, I will hand it over to Gia, who will speak a little bit more to the evolution of the project and the conceptualization of the book.
Thank you so much, Lona. And thank you again, everyone, for joining us here today, and to Giavana for hosting us. So as Lona mentioned, I'm going to be speaking a bit about conceptualizing the book. And Lona really nicely outlined for us, the key gaps that we really wanted to address through this project in existing literature and research. But what we also found were really gaps in the approach and design of research concepts themselves. And so that was an important process for us to undertake in doing that differently. So firstly, it's clear that existing literature on drugs and women has really had quite a US or European focus. And we really wanted this book and all of our chapters within the book to be truly international. And this meant that we would not only have chapters focused on different regions, but also that our contributors would come from different geographic regions as well, making it a truly kind of globally diverse project. So from Zimbabwe to the UK, Thailand to Mexico, a global scope was really central to what we wanted to achieve here, and really helped us to understand parallels across regions and how women engaged in illicit drug markets were impacted by drug policies. And in addition to kind of having quite a range of geographies within the book, we also wanted to have a range of disciplines within the book and overcome the silos that we often see in existing literature. If you look at much drug policy or drugs-related research, it may be limited to a public health focus, to a criminology focus, or security sector. And we wanted to not only have those different disciplines within the book, but also to have chapters and contributors who could speak across those silos and really draw the connections and linkages between them. And I think that really the intent there was to really have a more comprehensive view of this topic. And in addition to that, there's a clear lack of comprehensive quantitative data on the subject of women in drug policy, but there's an even greater lack of qualitative or ethnographic research. And it was really crucial to us not just to have numbers and statistics, which are lacking and which are important, but also to have narratives and storytelling to complement those within the book. And this approach, I think, wanting to have different disciplines within the book, different geographies and different types of research and voices, this allowed us to really bring together different communities operating within the drug policy field, including academics, those working for NGOs or in advocacy, policy experts and practitioners. And in addition to those voices, we also really wanted the book to be a platform for marginalized voices and for those with lived experience. I think those are often the voices which are left out or ignored within literature on this topic. And we felt that without those perspectives and those stories within the book, there would be a real gap in what we were trying to achieve and in building this fairly comprehensive picture on the topic of women and drugs. And part of that was also just an approach that values different forms of knowledge and expertise. And so we really wanted this project to be inclusive and respectful and really have a human-centered and rights-based approach to the research and to the creation and proliferation of knowledge in this area. So we put quite an emphasis on sharing and listening and creating a safe environment within our research, and also within throughout the process of conceptualizing the book itself, which I will speak to in a moment. And again, I think that really allowed us to hear from women with lived experience and those who are often marginalized within research and particularly within this topic. And lastly, this book was really framed, it was important for us to frame this as a collaborative effort and not just with a single owner. We, of course, are the editors, but we are not the owners of this book. It's really shared by all of our collaborators. And I think additionally, their communities and their networks as well. And so that's also one of the reasons we really wanted to make sure that this book would be open access, so that not only policymakers, academics, students, or researchers could access it, but also so that practitioners, the communities surrounding people who contributed and feminist groups could really access the literature and knowledge in an area that's lacking. And I would say overall, we took a deeply feminist approach to this book and to conceptualizing it that valued each of our authors, their contribution, and really valued different types of research, knowledge, and storytelling. And this approach really allowed us to address some of the gaps not only in research that exists, but I think also gaps in approach to existing literature on this topic. So I want to speak now about how we actually identified our contributors. We have quite a variety of contributors within the book. And it was important within the conceptualization of the book, to think about the variety of voices we wanted here. And so, we really reached out to our networks, academics, advocates, people with lived experience. And part of that was identifying our partners who are practitioners working within the NGO civil society sector. And that included key players in the global drug policy field, such as IDPC, or the International Drug Policy Consortium, Release, and the Washington Office on Latin America, as well as peer-based organizations like the International Network of People Who Use Drugs. And we also worked with more regional groups, including the Muslim Education and Welfare Association in Kenya, or De Justicia in Colombia. And so we had quite a range of partners, especially civil society partners in this, from local, regional, and global levels, offering their contributions to the book. And in addition to civil society groups, we also had quite a wide range of academic and research contributors. From institutions like the Eötvös Loránd University in Hungary to the Thailand Institute of Justice. It was important that our academic and research partners were also not only global North centered, but representative of academia globally. And I think this wide network of partners really allowed us to break those geographic and disciplinary silos that we sought out to do, and elevate the knowledge and expertise of researchers and practitioners and those with lived experience. So not only did we kind of reach out to our networks, but we were also able to convene with a variety of partners in the field through a number of workshops. And that really helped us to start to formalize and crystallize the concept for the book and the content that we really wanted to include through the various chapters. So we held 2 dedicated regional workshops, one in Budapest, Hungary, which had quite a global focus and brought participants from all over the world. And then another in Accra, Ghana, which brought together another smaller group, largely from West Africa, but from various African countries more generally. And then we had a third thematic workshop, which was held in Hong Kong in partnership with the Hong Kong University, and also had a more regional focus as well. And so each of these workshops really helped us to, build our own network and have deep conversations with these global and regional groups of academics, practitioners, and people with lived experience. And I think that really helped us to inform the content here. So, our participants came from a wide array of backgrounds. And as you can see in these photos, most were in fact women, although if you look closely, there are a few men who joined our workshops, and we appreciated their attendance. But I think for that reason, not only the diversity, but I think the kind of attitudes that everyone came with, it really presented a safe, respectful, and collaborative environment for us to discuss what can sometimes be a difficult topic, and also gave space for people to share their personal experiences, both empowering stories and sometimes difficult stories. And I think that's the kind of thing that doesn't often happen at larger, more structured, formal conferences. And by taking this approach of these smaller workshops with roughly 20, maybe 30 attendees, we could really dig deep into different issues and provide platforms for people to share their experiences and expertise. And it gave, not only us, but everyone their new insights into the issue of drug policy and its gendered impacts, and really build connections between geographies, between disciplines, and between experiences. And part of how we were able to do that was also how we facilitated these workshops. So rather than having a series of lectures or presentations, we had broad group discussions with everyone in attendance, some more focused sessions on certain themes, and we also did a number of mind mapping exercises. And I think that in particular really helped us to see those linkages between the issues that people were speaking about and between geographies and disciplines again. So through this process of conceptualizing the book itself, we arrived at our end product, which of course is the book, which is comprised of 34 chapters, all under this umbrella of the impact of global drug policy on women. And I don't necessarily want to go through every single chapter within the book now. I think we'd be here for quite a while. But I do want to highlight a few chapters over the next few slides that really show the scope of this work and how it speaks to the complexity of experience and also expertise and who is an expert when we talk about women and drugs. So here on this slide, we can see 2 chapters right off the bat. Fiona's story by Fiona Gilbertson, Suzanne's story by Suzanne Sharkey, which are both direct narratives from women with lived experience. That's a rare kind of thing to see alongside some more academic texts, such as April Shaw's chapter, Risk Behaviors Among Older Women Who Use Drugs, but really important in helping us to create a narrative about those with lived experience, and then research at the same time looking at a really understudied, underexplored topic like aging women who are using drugs. If we look at a couple more chapters here, Again, I think it's interesting to see the variety of chapters next to each other, and really demonstrates how we were trying to, break those silos between geographies and disciplines. So, for example, we have criminal justice, women and drug policy, and chapters that take you from Latin America to Russia to Kenya. And so again, you're kind of looking at a similar topic across geographies, helping the reader to see those linkages and build that more comprehensive perspective on this topic. And lastly, what I just want to emphasize is that, we have chapters that really illustrate the diversity of womanhood. And we did not approach this book with an essentializing view of women that reduces them to a biological category. That was really important to our approach. But rather we wanted to build an understanding of women as a really rich and diverse social category. And I think that's demonstrated across various chapters. So for example, here we have chapter 24, Queer Feminine Identities and the War on Drugs by Eilish Brennan, which speaks to the experience of trans and non-binary women who use drugs, all the way to Rose's story, a mother story looking at the experience of a mother who lost her children to overdose. And lastly, our final chapter, which I encourage everyone to read, by Judy Chang, which looks at the resilience of women who use drugs and really calls for feminists to take up this issue. And again, I think that these are different chapters, stories, and pieces of research that demonstrate the diversity of women impacted by the war on drugs, but also the shared impacts and shared resistance that they are all a part of. And so just to kind of summarize my lengthy review there, this book is really a balance of many perspectives, different types of knowledge, geographies, and disciplines. And it's a complex exploration of three areas that I think are often not brought together and often are not reconciled within a single book or within a single piece of research, but which really reflects the reality of drugs and women's engagement in drug economies. And that's sort of the negative outcomes, the risks, vulnerabilities, violence, and health impacts that women engaged in drug economies experience. At the same time, the strategies to address or mitigate those negative outcomes. And also, very importantly, the positive experiences of pleasure, joy, self-exploration, community building, autonomy, and liberatory impacts that women engaged in drug economies experience. So our aim was really to bring those kind of three components together and really balance them across our chapters and even within chapters themselves. So thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Julia to take a look at our key findings.
Thank you, Gia. So not really wanting to, kind of dwell too much, because I think we outlined some of the challenges at the beginning, and we were hoping more to kind of focus your attention on the work that we did to try and bring such a diverse community of participants together. Very quickly, the key findings here is that women are very, very differently impacted from men by the actions of law enforcement and the criminalization of drugs, and that these impacts are overwhelmingly negative of drug criminalization and very kind of, law enforcement focused responses to the international drug trade. And these negative experiences are universalized. And as Gia said before in going through some of her slides, what's extraordinary is to talk about similar experiences, shared experiences, whether we're talking about Nigeria, whether we're talking about Scotland, whether we're talking about Colombia. I mean, it's just this homogeneity of negative impacts of criminalization. The emphasis on intersecting vulnerabilities. So this is felt harder by women, determined by race and class and sexuality and by age. So, women are differentially impacted amongst the community of women themselves. And so ultimately what we see is what we like to frame as a kind of double burden on women, which is both the violence of the illicit drug trade itself, but then also the violence of drug policy enforcement, criminalization of drugs, and this very, very strong security-focused repressive response to engagement in the illicit drug trade. And the key words that really came up for many of our participants in exercises such as mind mapping and discourse analysis, you see them there in that circle: stigma, vulnerability, discrimination, sexual violence. These were all slightly nuanced to the kind of local or regional geographic context, But again, the perpetrators constantly, when we're talking about violence and enforcement, it's the police, it's in the prison service. A lot of women talking about the kind of discrimination they felt they had received from doctors, from treatment providers, and then also in the criminal justice system and from within their own families. You know, it goes right back to this slide that Lona started with about, you know, this notion of what constitutes a good woman and how any form of engagement in the illicit drug trade is really seen as deviance to be punished. So these are very, very powerful words, and they were words that were shared, as we said, across our communities of women, across geographies, across regions. And these are just a couple of slides here. We had some excellent chapters on, for example, female incarceration in Latin America, really highlighting the disproportionalities, of women who are now being incarcerated on drug-related offences. So even though we see that we have infinitely more males who are in prison, the proportion of females in prison on drug-related offences is higher than men. And this is not simply in Latin America, where it is in fact particularly pronounced. I mean, if you look here at somewhere like El Salvador, you know, 644% increase in the number of women going to prison on drug-related offences. This is a global phenomenon. We saw this across Southeast Asia. We saw this across Central European countries. So if we look at the kind of established 5 core critiques of drug policy enforcement, this emphasis on criminalisation, this emphasis on punitive punishment, the 5 core critiques generally are that this kind of response to the illicit drug trade creates violence, impunity, because the security sector is kind of elevated in its repressive responses to the drug trade. It's not actually addressing the growth of illicit drug markets. Criminalisation and repression creates greater public health risks, and it actually targets those who are the most vulnerable, the kind of low-hanging fruit, rather than the high-level organised crime operators. And in all of those 5 aspects of this critique of drug policy enforcement, women are in particular negatively impacted, and they are very, very differently positioned from men. Conscious of the time, and the slides I believe will be made available to you, just to give you a very quick taste of some of the issues that we found, for example, in terms of the negative health impacts of criminalisation. One thing that did keep coming over recurrently in our meetings with women and with the contributors was that women are really, really reluctant to try and seek, where treatment services are available, any kind of support. And this is because of the stigma, this is because of the shame associated with female drug use. But in particular, women are really scared of accessing services because they are so fearful of losing access to their children. This came across, as I said before, across country context. Not only are women scared of losing access to their children, you know, in contexts where women have very high levels of care responsibilities, the loss of a woman who's trying to seek treatment services or through the criminal justice system has really negative ramifications for those within that woman's circle of care. Routine violations of women's privacy, particularly pregnant women. Support services and treatment services are completely inappropriate. They're totally modelled around the male drug experience. Accessing treatment can be very, very expensive for women. Treatment regimes themselves are highly gender insensitive. What we kept finding for those women who sought treatment, attended treatment services, was that it was very difficult for them to kind of stay on programs because there was a great deal of reluctance and discrimination against having female drug users on treatment programs, because there was a view that they weren't able to kind of maintain the routine of the treatment services. A lot of the time this was because of childcare issues for women. And this goes back to the whole issue of gender insensitivity and treatment design. There was issues about women accessing treatment services safely. You know, sometimes these kind of treatment opportunities were located in areas that posed a high level of risk for women to try and access. Childcare, as I said, was a particular problem. But one of the things that, again, that kept coming back to us is that unless you have very, very differentiated male and female treatment services, a lot of women, in particular young women, felt very vulnerable and very exposed going into treatment services that were overwhelmingly dominated by men. The other kind of negative aspects here of the health impacts of this criminalisation model is that we found over and over again that a lot of women reported, kind of pressure from male drug using partners not to enter into treatment programs and to persist with patterns of drug use, which really expose women to higher levels of disease and violence. Just in terms of the criminal justice system, The shift that we've seen, particularly since the 1998 UN Convention on Illicit Traffic, the introduction of mandatory minimum sentencing for drug offences, which does not take into account the particular circumstances and vulnerabilities and care responsibilities of women, is having this really terribly egregious impact, disproportionality in sentencing, and particularly where this relates to low-level non-violent drug offending. A lot of women reported lack of access to legal representation when they were arrested for drug-related offences, and they had usually been coerced into drug-related offences, and particularly when this related to aspects such as trafficking. Once in prison, women were frequently denied access to their families. There was a lack of treatment options. Unfortunately, something that did keep coming across over and over again was the violence, and in particular the sexual violence that women experienced in police and prison settings. The last two kind of slides here on the findings here is that there are major limitations in drug policy processes. In particular, as we said right at the beginning, the spaces around policy are completely dominated by men. Women have very limited opportunity for voice, for input, for participation in monitoring and evaluation. Absolute dearth of gender-sensitive data, gender-sensitive information. And as a result of this, and when you kind of look across the UN system in areas such as development and peacekeeping, drug policy really stands out for its gender insensitivity, particularly around program development and metrics, and the lack of training for people who work within drug policy on the importance of gender sensitivity. Overall, we'd say that states are failing in their international commitments on human rights and on gender equality. Just drawing this out, the final unintended and unmeasured impacts of drug criminalisation and very security-focused enforcement measures led by policing and security sectors is that it's not just a short-term arrest and incarceration of women that's causing terrible damage. As I said before, it's also about the impacts on children and other dependents. This is leading to the intergenerational transmission of poverty and exclusion. We feel that this is seriously undermining progress towards internationally agreed development goals and objectives. It's undermining public health. And overall, at the end of the day, this is doing nothing to reduce either the incentives for entry into illicit drug supply or illicit drug use. Our most important finding, and ending on an optimistic note, is that we're really seeing now the mobilization of women around drug policy reform. Women are really becoming an increasingly visible, still low level, but an increasingly unified and international lobby for change. Alliance building is occurring across different countries and across women in different aspects of engagement in drug policy research and also within the drug trade. We're seeing some fantastic leadership in peer support initiatives, which we talk about in the book, and really also trying to build outwards to other communities in areas such as security, development, and peacekeeping. And so really here, what I would, very much emphasize is that we are seeing a new level of agency and activism by women around issues of the terrible negative impacts that criminalization and drug policy has on all women. The final slide here is a total disaster because the little pop-ups that were meant to happen haven't occurred. But what I would finish by saying is that this is really a real challenge of funding, trying to do this research on women. We were hugely fortunate that this research was funded by the Open Society Foundations, which enabled us to travel the world, to bring groups of women together and to really get these voices heard. It's really difficult, through national funding programs to kind of get the level of resources that was required to try and pull this project together. Open access is a wonderful thing. It's also a complete misnomer. It's very expensive to have open access facilities, about $14,000 I think this cost us to have open access. And that would not have been possible had it not been for financial support from Open Society Foundations, the International Network of People Using Drugs, and also University of California, San Diego. So on that note, thank you very much for your attention, and I will finish there.
Thank you so much. Am I frozen? No, I'm back. Okay. Yes, that was, I just find this book an incredibly ambitious work that was really needed to fill a gap because there just isn't enough on this topic. And moving forward. It's sort of trying to, it's a really good launch pad, shall we say, to moving forward and thinking about how we can fill those gaps and collect the data. And I posted in while you were talking how much I actually did love the personal stories in the book, Happy in particular. And I just thought it was a really nice way of weaving it all together. So looking at our chat, there was not a question, but a comment from our colleague, Michael Osman. He says, not so much a question, but I want to advertise our forthcoming research on Afghan women's involvement in the opiate trade. While this will be a small study, it will be a little step forward in looking at the issue from a non-Western perspective, and we'll try to look at questions of autonomy, motivation, and structure. So that's coming down the pipeline from our colleagues in the RAB branch, it's the Research and Analysis branch. And Giavana Franca said, I really appreciated the chapter on incarceration for drug-related offenses in Latin America. Some are victims of human trafficking and commit crimes as drug smuggling per coercion and are still convicted. Could you please comment on the relationship between drug-related offenses and human trafficking, if possible?
I'll start on this if Lona and Gia are happy with this. I think it's a very, very mixed picture, and I think we need to be very careful in how we unpack this. And I think we need to move away from generic understandings of women's involvement in trafficking. In a number of instances, and depending on what level of trafficking we're talking about, in some cases, women are, you know, it's a choice to engage in some level of illicit drug movements. It's a very constrained choice, but it's a choice within the context of limited alternative livelihoods. So this is kind of women's engagements in the informal economy. That came across, for example, in the chapters on Zimbabwe. It came across in some of the work that's been done in Southeast Asia and in Thailand, and also in Latin America. At the same time, what we have also is, you know, those women who are, and this again came across very much in Latin America, women who probably occupy very low-level positions in a wealthier family household who have been encouraged or asked to carry drugs, not knowing they were carrying drugs when that family was, for example, going on holiday from Argentina to Mexico. Karina Giacomello and Coletta Youngers at the Washington Office on Latin America have done some fantastic work on this. They have a whole project speaking to women who felt, you know, were either tricked or coerced or chose to engage in some form of trafficking. Now, you know, the notion here of coercion within drug trafficking, as I said, we have to be very, very minded in how we unpick this, because what in particular we've seen in a number of North American and West European countries is that we have women who are, for example, saved, as it were, from trafficking and coercion in trafficking offences, but they are then, for example, deported back to their country of origin. So I think there's a, you know, maybe I'm speaking too much for Lona and Gia here, but I think we're kind of seeing some of the language around trafficking of women and trafficking offences as also being deeply securitized and not necessarily engaging with the drivers or the vulnerabilities of women, or in policy terms, responding to the needs that women have once they have been identified and should really be being supported once they have been kind of brought into this network of security. Sorry, we've got a bit of gap in space and time. That I was just slightly distracted by this question from Sarah Scott, because in relation to research on women and drug use, which geographical regions are particularly underserved? Which regions do you find it particularly difficult, not possible to find research and contributors? I think the reality was, Sarah, you know, the point that was made before, places like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Southwest Asia has been quite a challenge. There is some good work coming out of Myanmar at the moment on the opiate trade and the synthetic drug trade there. East Africa slightly, North Africa slightly as well, but that I think was more a kind of, you know, challenge of accessing the data and also the limitations of the networks that we were able to access. What's actually come out of the research we've done on this book, and probably to the abject horror of Lona and Giavana Margo, is we've had many people saying, well, when are we going to have, volume number 2 and volume number 3 to cover all these geographical regions that you didn't cover in the first book? But I would particularly say here, I think, Sarah, in response to your question, Southwest Asia, I think was a real challenge for us to try and tap into.
From my point of view, I'm just curious, what would you say in terms of what you've seen globally, were the more progressive attempts? Because I think even in a lot of the West and Europe and North America, we are failing deeply on how we're underserving women with regards to drug policy. But are there any sort of success stories that you might want to highlight of things working out, or really well thought out policy that you've come across?
Giavana, did you were nodding your head then, Giavana, Margo. Is there any that come to mind for you?
Yeah, I mean, not necessarily policy. I was mostly nodding my head, just thinking about, I think, some of the really incredible and effective sort of programs or support services that are peer-led that we came across. I think, for example, Metzeneres in Barcelona, which is a women and gender diverse peer-led space for women and people who use drugs. It's actually not featured in the book, maybe in the next edition, but very interesting to check out. And I also think across Eastern Europe as well, there's some really incredible work that women who use drugs are doing to take care of each other, to take care of their communities. And I'm hesitant to sort of, as one of our contributors said, romanticize survival. But I think some of the most effective services and programming that we've seen actually came really from the ground up, and from, people who they're experts on what kinds of services or what kinds of programming are needed because it's their reality. And I think that's really why we wanted those stories to be, and those voices to be in the book, because I think those are the voices that often don't inform policy. And they are so effective in what they're doing, in taking care of one another, of keeping one another safe, whether it comes to like health or security. And so that's sort of my, not necessarily a policy, but I think something that was really inspiring to see, and hopefully will inform policies to be more effective in addressing some of those issues.
I think I'd just jump in as well and say that for me, especially the chapters that focused on Latin America, I think it's interesting that they were all sustained and complemented by personal narratives. And then more broadly within the collection, we talk a lot about having, people from academia, from programmatic or practitioner or NGO roles, and then people with lived experience. But what's interesting is that for a lot of these chapters, I think, within the editorial process, we had expectations about what they might look like. And what we see is that there's, it's hard to delineate between some of them. Many of the, really well-established researchers are also informed by experiences of lived experience. And many of those with lived experience have a tremendous amount of more academic knowledge within what it is that they're dealing with. So it all sort of was woven together to form this collective knowledge. And I think that was much of the value of the book. But unfortunately, I don't know that I could point to any really specific policy that I think has been exemplary or a model to follow. Although there's, of course, many inroads and many successes that we're seeing evolve.
But I think Giavana's point here is absolutely, central. It's kind of the success stories are in spite of national policies rather than because of them. And it really has been, kind of peer-led and grassroots. I'm just seeing Obajuro's question here talking about Nigeria. We did have people from the Precious Jewels organization who came to our meeting in Ghana. And, the leadership of that organization is phenomenal. I mean, some of the, kind of women who came along to our meetings from West and East Africa, we had Senegal came along, our colleague from Senegal, and from Nigeria. These were really powerful speakers and representatives for their community, and they are fighting for a very, very important space. But, completely agree, there still needs to be, a lot of work done around these cultural and societal nuances as put in the question here. But it's pervasive, it's across the world. The kind of cultural nuances of Scotland are the same as the, well, not the same, but, these kind of paradigms of misogyny and discrimination and exclusion that women face across the globe. And that was just what was so potent in the book. If anybody wants to be in touch with us for, proposals of colleagues and groups to link up with in any of your parts of the world, please do, because I feel volume 2 might be coming along, which is why Lona and Giavana might suddenly disappear off screen any second.
I'm really excited to hear there might be a volume 2, because I really think this was a valuable work. And thank you so much for joining us today. I think this has been really an enriching experience. I loved hearing about how you conceptualized and how this book came together and all the different players it took. And thank you to our audience. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Indeed, we've recorded the session, so we will probably be posting that on our YouTube channel. So we'll send out all the participants who came today the link to that, and we'll probably post it on our library website as well. Thank you. I know people have things to do, but I really, really appreciate this, and I found it incredibly interesting.
Thank you so much for having us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you.
Yeah, this
Thank
was
you.
a really lovely experience for us.